I knew something was wrong the moment the taxi turned onto my street. I had only been gone 4 days. For days visiting my younger sister in Columbus, the longest trip I had taken in nearly a year. At 68, I rarely traveled anymore. My house in Pennsylvania had become my whole little world. The creaky front porch, the old maple tree in the yard, the kitchen window where I drank coffee every morning. So when the taxi stopped in front of my house that afternoon, I expected everything to look exactly the same. But it didn't. There was a black SUV parked in my driveway. Not Daniel's car. Not any car I recognized. At first, I assumed maybe one of the neighbors had a visitor and parked in the wrong spot. That happens sometimes. Our street was quiet and friendly, and people didn't always worry too much about where they left their cars. But then I noticed something else. A small pink tricycle was sitting on my front porch. I stood there for a moment with my suitcase beside me, staring at it. I didn't own a tricycle. There hadn't been a child living in my house for over 30 years. The taxi driver asked if everything was okay. I told him yes. But the truth was, my stomach had already started to tighten. I slowly walked up the path to my front door, and that's when I saw the shoes. 2 pairs of adult shoes, and a tiny pair of children's sneakers, all sitting neatly on the welcome mat I had bought 10 years ago. My hands began to shake a little as I reached into my purse for my keys. Maybe Daniel had stopped by. My son still had a key to the house. I had given it to him years ago just in case. Though he rarely visited these days, I told myself maybe he had decided to bring his family over. Maybe they were just inside waiting for me. Maybe they wanted to surprise me. That thought almost made me smile. But the moment I unlocked the door and stepped inside, I heard a woman's voice. Not my daughter-in-law. Not anyone I knew. Just a stranger. Laughing. From my kitchen, I slowly walked past the living room doorway. And that's when a man I had never seen before stepped into the hallway and looked straight at me. For a moment, we both just stared at each other. Then he frowned slightly and said, "Can I help you, ma'am?" I tightened my grip on my purse, because the man standing in front of me was inside my house. And it was very clear. He thought I was the one who didn't belong there. For a moment, I honestly thought I had walked into the wrong house. It sounds ridiculous, I know. I had lived there for 32 years. I knew every scratch on the hardwood floor, every crack in the ceiling above the hallway light. But the way that man looked at me, confused, slightly annoyed, made me question my own eyes. He stood there in my hallway like he belonged. Like I was the stranger. "Can I help you, ma'am?" he repeated, his voice polite but guarded. I blinked slowly, trying to steady myself. I live here," I said. The words felt strange leaving my mouth. The man frowned. Behind him, the woman's laughter from the kitchen stopped. A second later, a young woman appeared in the doorway. She was holding a coffee mug, my coffee mug, the one with the little blue flowers my sister had given me 10 years ago. She looked at me, then at the man. "Who is it?" she asked. "I'm not sure," the man replied. Not sure. Those 2 words hit me harder than anything else so far. I slowly stepped further into the hallway and looked past them toward my kitchen. Everything was different. There were toys on the floor. A colorful plastic high chair next to my dining table. My curtains had been replaced with bright yellow ones I had never seen before. And there, sitting at my kitchen counter, swinging his legs and eating what looked like cereal, was a little boy. He couldn't have been older than 4. The young woman noticed where I was looking and gently placed a hand on the boy's shoulder. "Sweetie, finish your breakfast," she said quietly. Then she turned back to me. "I think you might have the wrong address," she said carefully. Wrong address. I felt a strange ringing in my ears. "This is my house," I said again, a little firmer this time. "I live here." The man and woman exchanged a glance. Not a shocked glance. Not a worried one. More like confusion mixed with mild irritation. The man crossed his arms. "Ma'am," he said, choosing his words slowly. "We've been renting this house for 2 months. 2 months. My heart skipped. "That's impossible," I said immediately. "I was here last week." He shrugged slightly. "Well, we signed the lease with the owner. Everything's legal." "The owner?" My stomach dropped. "I am the owner," I said. The silence that followed felt thick and uncomfortable. The little boy continued eating his cereal, completely unaware of the tension filling the room. The woman frowned at me now, clearly unsure what to believe. Finally, she asked the question that made my chest tighten. "Wait, are you Mrs. Carter?" I nodded slowly. "Yes, Margaret Carter." She inhaled sharply. Then she looked at the man again. And that's when she said something that made my hands start trembling. But, Daniel told us you moved to Florida. But, Daniel told us you moved to Florida. For a few seconds, I couldn't say anything. I just stood there in my own hallway, staring at this young woman holding my coffee mug, trying to understand what she had just said. My son told you that? I finally asked. She nodded slowly. Yes, Daniel Carter. He said the house belonged to his mother, but she decided to move to Florida permanently and asked him to handle the property. My chest tightened. Florida? I had never even talked about moving to Florida. The man stepped forward a little, clearly trying to keep things calm. Look, ma'am, he said. We signed a lease agreement with him 2 months ago. We paid first month, last month, and a deposit. 2 months. I felt my knees weaken slightly. 2 months ago, that was around the time Daniel had suddenly started calling me more often, asking small questions about the house, how the plumbing was doing, whether I still planned to travel sometimes. At the time, I had thought he was just being thoughtful. Now those conversations felt very different. You're telling me, I said slowly, that my son rented you this house? The couple exchanged another uneasy glance. Well, yes, the man said carefully. The young woman quickly added, he showed us documents. Ownership papers. Everything looked legitimate. Ownership papers. I shook my head. No, I whispered. That couldn't be right. The deed to this house had always been in my name. My husband. And I bought it back in 1991. After he passed away, nothing changed. I never transferred it to Daniel. Never even considered it. This house belongs to me. I said again, more firmly now. I never authorized anyone to rent it. The man's expression shifted slightly. Not angry. More like concerned. Do you mind if I show you something? He asked. Before I could answer, he walked to the kitchen counter and picked up a folder. He brought it over and carefully handed me a few papers. My hands were shaking as I looked down at them. It was a lease agreement. The address at the top was correct. My address. The rental term clearly stated 12 months. And then I saw the name listed as the property owner. Daniel Carter. My son. My throat went dry. At the bottom of the page was a signature. His signature. And beneath it, a line that made my stomach twist. Authorized representative of property owner Margaret Carter. I felt like the air had been sucked out of the hallway. I never signed anything like this, I said quietly. The woman looked genuinely worried now. You're saying he didn't have permission? I slowly lowered the papers. No, I said. Then I looked around my house again. The toys. The furniture that had been moved. The strangers living in my kitchen. And a terrible thought finally formed in my mind. If Daniel had rented out my house, then where exactly did he think I was supposed to live? The question kept repeating in my head. If Daniel rented out my house, where exactly did he expect me to go? I slowly placed the lease papers back into the man's hands. My fingers felt numb, like they didn't fully belong to me anymore. For a moment, none of us spoke. The young woman looked uncomfortable now, shifting her weight slightly, while the little boy in the kitchen continued crunching his cereal. Finally, she said softly, maybe there's just been some misunderstanding. I wanted to believe that, more than anything. But something deep in my chest already knew this wasn't a misunderstanding. This was something else. Something deliberate. I need to call my son, I said. My voice sounded calmer than I felt. I pulled my phone from my purse and scrolled to Daniel's number. My hands were still shaking a little when I pressed the call button. It rang. Once. Twice. 3 times. Then it went to voicemail. I hung up and tried again. This time it rang longer. And just when I thought it would go to voicemail again, the line clicked. Hey, Mom, Daniel said casually. Did you get back from your trip already? The sound of his relaxed voice made my stomach twist. Yes, I said slowly. I just got home. There was a small pause on the line. Not long, but long enough. Oh, he said. That one word told me everything. He knew. Daniel. I continued, trying to keep my voice steady. There are people living in my house. Another pause. This one was longer. Then he sighed. Mom, we talked about this. My heart skipped. No, I said immediately. We did not talk about this. Well, we talked about how you didn't really need that big house anymore, he replied. And how you were thinking about traveling more. Traveling more. I almost laughed at the absurdity of it. I went to Columbus for 4 days, I said. On the other end of the phone, Daniel sounded impatient now. Mom, look. The house was just sitting there most of the time. I found a nice family who needed a place. It's temporary. Temporary. I looked over at the couple standing in my hallway. Their child. Their belongings. The lease agreement that said 12 months. You rented my house without telling me? I asked. He exhaled loudly. I'm helping you, Mom. Do you know how expensive it is to maintain a house like that? Property taxes alone are crazy. Helping me. The words felt like a slap. Daniel, I said quietly, where exactly did you expect me to live? For a few seconds, there was nothing but silence on the phone. Then he said something that made my chest feel cold. Well, I figured you'd stay with me for a while. Well, I figured you'd stay with me for a while. For a moment, I thought I had misheard him. Stay with you? I repeated slowly. Yeah, Daniel said, as if it were the most reasonable idea in the world. You know, just temporarily, until we figure out what to do long term. I looked around the hallway of the house I had lived in for over 3 decades. The same hallway where Daniel had taken his first steps, where I had measured his height on the wall every birthday until he turned 16. And now he was talking about it like it was just some extra property he had decided to manage. You rented out my house, I said carefully, without asking me first. Mom, it's not a big deal, he replied, his voice growing impatient. You're acting like I sold it or something. The couple in front of me were pretending not to listen, but I could tell they were hearing every word. I turned slightly away from them, lowering my voice. Daniel, I said, these people have a 12-month lease. Well, yeah, he said. That's how rentals work. My grip tightened on the phone. You signed a contract on a house that does not belong to you. Another pause. Then he sighed again, louder this time. Mom, legally it's basically mine anyway. I'm your only child. I felt something heavy settle in my chest. Legally it's basically mine. That is not how ownership works, I said quietly. Well, it will be eventually, he replied. The casual way he said it made my stomach turn. Eventually. As if I were already gone. As if the house had already passed on to him. I closed my eyes for a second, trying to steady my breathing. Daniel, I said, I am standing inside my house right now with strangers who believe they rented it from you. Okay, so, he said. So what do you expect me to do tonight? I asked. There was a short pause. Then he said something that made my heart sink. Well, you can come stay with us. I already knew that answer was coming. What about the guest room? I asked. Another pause. Oh, well, actually we turned that into Emma's playroom. Emma was his daughter. My granddaughter. So where exactly would I sleep? I asked. We can put an air mattress in the basement, he said. The basement. At 68 years old. After renting out the house I owned. I slowly opened my eyes and looked around again. At the strangers. At the toys scattered across my living room floor. At the family photos that were still hanging on the wall behind them. And that's when I realized something that made my chest tighten even more. Daniel hadn't just rented out my house. He had already decided. I didn't live here anymore. I ended the call. Without saying goodbye. For a moment, I just stood there in the hallway holding my phone, staring at the dark screen. The house felt strangely unfamiliar now. Not because the furniture had moved. Not because of the toys or the yellow curtains. But because of the realization that had just settled in my chest. My own son had already decided this house wasn't mine anymore. The young couple was still standing a few feet away from me, clearly unsure what to say. Finally, the woman spoke carefully. Is everything okay? I let out a slow breath. No, I said honestly. She nodded slightly, as if she had expected that answer. The man rubbed the back of his neck and glanced toward the kitchen where their little boy was now humming to himself, while pushing cereal pieces around his bowl. Look, he said, lowering his voice. We didn't know anything about this. I believe you, I replied. And I did. They looked like a normal young family trying to make things work. Nothing about them suggested they were part of some scheme. In fact, they looked more uncomfortable than I felt. We moved here for my job, the man continued. We relocated from Michigan. Daniel showed us the house, gave us paperwork, even keys. He held up the lease folder again. We wouldn't have moved our family if we thought something was wrong. I understand, I said softly. The woman hesitated before asking the question that was clearly on both their minds. So what happens now? That was a very good question. And the truth was, I didn't have the answer yet. For 32 years, I had handled every problem in this house myself. Broken pipes, roof repairs, storm damage. My husband and I had always figured things out together. But this situation felt different. This wasn't a broken pipe. This was my own son making decisions about my life behind my back. I slowly walked into the living room and set my suitcase down next to the couch. The couch where Daniel used to fall asleep watching cartoons when he was 8 years old. I ran my hand lightly across the armrest. You said you've been here 2 months? I asked. The man nodded. Since the beginning of summer. That meant Daniel had been collecting rent from them for 8 weeks already. 8 weeks of money. For a house that didn't belong to him. A quiet anger began to build somewhere deep inside me. Not loud. Not explosive. Just steady. The kind that grows when you realize someone you trusted has crossed a line they can't uncross. I turned back to them. Did Daniel ever show you a deed? I asked. They both shook their heads. No, the woman said. Just the lease agreement. I nodded slowly. That confirmed what I was starting to suspect. Daniel had been hoping I would never find out. Maybe he thought I'd start traveling more. Maybe he thought I'd eventually move in with him. Maybe he thought I'd simply accept it. But standing there in my own living room, something became very clear to me. My son might have assumed I was too old to fight this. Too tired. Too confused. Too dependent. But Daniel had forgotten one very important thing. This house wasn't just my property. It was my life. And I wasn't about to let someone take it away from me. For the first time since walking into the house, I sat down. The couch felt familiar under me, even though the room looked different. I placed my purse beside me and took a slow breath, trying to organize my thoughts. The young couple stayed standing near the hallway, clearly unsure whether they should leave me alone or keep talking. Finally, the man stepped forward a little. Ma'am, I'm really sorry about this, he said. If we had known, I interrupted gently. I looked up at them and gave a small nod. You didn't do anything wrong. And I meant it. They had answered an advertisement, toured a house, signed a lease, and moved their family. Everything they had done was normal. The problem wasn't them. The problem was my son. What are your names? I asked. The woman seemed relieved by the simple question. I'm Laura, she said. And this is my husband, Mike. She gestured toward the little boy in the kitchen. And that's Ethan. Ethan looked up when he heard his name, waved his spoon at us, then went back to his cereal. Despite everything happening around him, he seemed perfectly happy. I couldn't help but smile a little. Well, Laura. Mike, I said slowly. I'm not here to throw anyone out today. Both of them visibly relaxed. That's not fair to you. I continued. And it's certainly not fair to your son. Mike nodded gratefully. Thank you, he said quietly. But my mind was already moving ahead. This situation wasn't going to fix itself. I reached for my phone again. Laura watched me carefully. Are you calling Daniel? She asked. I shook my head. No. I opened my contacts and scrolled down to another number. A number I hadn't needed in several years. My lawyer. When my husband passed away, Harold Simmons had helped me with all the paperwork, the will, the house deed, the financial accounts. Back then, he had told me something I never forgot. If anyone ever tries to pressure you about your property, call me first. At the time, I never imagined that anyone might include my own son. The phone rang twice before Harold answered. Margaret, he said warmly. Well, this is a surprise. Hello, Harold, I replied. There was a short pause as he heard something in my voice. Is everything all right? I looked around the living room again. At the new curtains. At the toys. At the strangers who had been told my house was available. Not exactly, I said. Then I explained everything. The lease. The tenants. The papers Daniel had signed. Harold listened quietly without interrupting. When I finished, the line stayed silent for a moment. Then he said something that made my heart beat a little faster. Margaret, did you give Daniel power of attorney at any point? No, I said immediately. Did you sign anything transferring ownership? Absolutely not. Another pause. Then Harold spoke again, his voice more serious now. In that case, he said, your son may have committed something very serious. I felt the room go very still. Serious? I repeated. Yes, he said carefully. From what you've told me, Daniel may have just committed fraud. Fraud. The word hung in the air longer than I expected. I repeated it quietly, almost like I was testing how it sounded out loud. Across the room, Laura and Mike were watching me carefully. They couldn't hear Harold on the phone, but they could clearly see that the conversation had taken a serious turn. Yes, Harold said calmly. If Daniel signed legal documents claiming authority he didn't have, that can fall under fraud or misrepresentation. I rubbed my forehead slowly. This is my son we're talking about, I said. I understand, Harold replied. His tone softened a little. But legally speaking, family relationships don't change property law. That sentence settled heavily in my chest. For 68 years, family had always come first in my life. Every sacrifice, every decision I made had been for Daniel's future. And now here I was discussing legal violations committed by him. What should I do? I asked quietly. Harold didn't hesitate. First, don't sign anything and don't make any agreements with your son until we sort this out. I won't, I said. Second, he continued, I want to confirm the deed is still fully in your name. I'll check the county records today. That hasn't changed, I said. I never transferred anything. Good, he said. That makes things clearer. I looked toward the kitchen where Ethan had now moved on from cereal to pushing a toy truck across the tile floor. Laura followed my gaze. What about the family living here? I asked. That's the complicated part, Harold admitted. I could hear papers rustling on his end of the line. If they signed a lease in good faith, they're technically tenants. Even if Daniel had no authority to rent the property. So they didn't do anything wrong? I asked. Not based on what you've told me, he said. I nodded slowly. That confirmed what my instincts had already told me. The couple standing in my living room wasn't the problem. They were just caught in the middle of something they never asked for. So what happens now? I asked. Harold paused before answering. Well, Margaret, you have a few options. I waited. You could pursue legal action against Daniel for unauthorized rental and misrepresentation. The words felt heavy. Legal action. Against my own son. Another option, Harold continued, is resolving it privately. But that would still require him to acknowledge what he did and correct the lease situation. I already knew Daniel well enough to doubt that would happen easily. Harold, I said carefully, can Daniel legally force me out of my own house? Absolutely not, he replied immediately. If the deed is in your name, you are the legal owner. No one can remove you from that property without your consent. For the first time since walking into the house, I felt a small sense of stability return. The house was still legally mine. That mattered. But Harold wasn't finished. There is one more thing you should prepare. For, he said. What's that? If Daniel realizes you've spoken with a lawyer, he may try to pressure you to let this arrangement continue. I looked around the room again. At the toys. At the unfamiliar curtains. At the life that had been placed inside my house without my permission. A quiet determination settled inside me. I'm not leaving my home, I said firmly. Harold didn't sound surprised. Good, he replied. Because if this situation continues, we may need to remind your son exactly who owns that house. After I hung up with Harold, the house felt quieter than before. Not peaceful, just heavy. I slowly placed my phone on the coffee table and looked over at Laura and Mike. They had been waiting patiently, clearly trying not to interrupt my conversation. Laura spoke first. Is everything going to be okay? She asked. Her voice carried a mix of concern and worry. Not just for me, but for their own situation too. I couldn't blame her. If someone suddenly showed up claiming they own the house you had just moved into, you'd be nervous too. I spoke with my lawyer, I said calmly. That seemed to catch their attention immediately. Mike straightened slightly. And, he asked carefully. I took a slow breath before answering. He's checking the property records right now. But as far as I know, the house is still fully in my name. Mike nodded slowly. That's what you mentioned earlier. Yes, I said. For a moment, the three of us stood there in the living room, trying to process what that meant. Laura finally asked the question everyone had been avoiding. So, are we being asked to leave? Her voice was gentle, but I could hear the tension underneath. I looked toward Ethan again. He was now driving his toy truck across the floor, making soft engine noises. The kind of quiet little sounds children make when they're completely comfortable. The idea of throwing them out immediately didn't sit right with me. No, I said. Both of them looked surprised. At least not today. Their shoulders visibly relaxed. I'm not here to make a family with a small child pack their bags on the spot. I continued. This situation isn't your fault. Mike nodded slowly, clearly grateful. Thank you, he said. But, I added gently, we do need to figure out what my son did and how to fix it. They both agreed quickly. Mike hesitated before speaking again. Can I be honest with you? He asked. Of course. When Daniel showed us the house, something did feel a little rushed. I raised an eyebrow. Rushed? Yeah, he said. He kept saying he needed tenants quickly because his mother had already moved away. I almost laughed at that. Moved away. I left town for 4 days, I said quietly. Laura shook her head in disbelief. He told us you were already settling in Florida. Florida again. It was strange hearing how confidently Daniel had told that story. Almost like he believed it himself. Mike continued. He also asked us to pay the deposit through a bank transfer instead of a rental platform. That detail made something click in my mind. How much did you pay him? I asked. Mike glanced at Laura before answering. $6,000. 6,000. 2 months' rent and a security deposit. Money my son had taken for a house he had no legal right to rent. The quiet anger inside me grew a little stronger. But before I could say anything else, my phone buzzed on the table. Harold. I picked it up quickly. Margaret, he said the moment I answered. I checked the county property records. My heart beat faster. And? I asked. He didn't hesitate. The deed hasn't changed. I felt a small wave of relief wash through me. The house is still 100% in your name. But Harold wasn't finished. And Margaret, there's something else you need to know. My stomach tightened. What is it? His voice became more serious. Your son didn't just rent the house. He tried to list it for sale last month. For a moment, I thought I had misunderstood Harold. Sale. I repeated slowly. Across the room, Laura and Mike were watching my face carefully. They couldn't hear Harold, but they could clearly see that whatever he was saying wasn't good news. Yes, Harold confirmed. The listing was submitted through a real estate platform. It didn't stay active long, but the record is still visible. My chest felt tight. So he tried to sell my house? Attempted to, Harold said. But the sale couldn't proceed because the title search showed the property is still in your name. That small legal detail was the only thing that had stopped it. Not Daniel. Not his conscience. Just paperwork. I slowly sank back into the couch. For how much? I asked. Harold shuffled some papers. The listing price was $420,000. Laura quietly gasped when she heard that number. I hadn't realized she had stepped closer during the call. That's a lot, she whispered. But to me, the number didn't matter nearly as much as what it represented. Daniel hadn't just been renting out my home. He had been trying to get rid of it entirely. When did he list it? I asked. About 3 weeks ago, Harold replied. 3 weeks. Which meant that while I was planting flowers in the backyard, while I was talking to my neighbors, while I was living my normal quiet life, my son had been trying to sell the house behind my back. Did anyone try to buy it? I asked. There were a few inquiries, Harold said. But the listing agent quickly ran into issues with the ownership documents. That was when it likely disappeared from the market. Not because Daniel stopped, but because he couldn't continue. I closed my eyes for a moment. When Daniel was 6 years old, he once cried for an entire afternoon because he thought he had lost his favorite toy truck. I spent 2 hours helping him search the house until we finally found it under the couch. Back then, the worst thing he could imagine was losing something he loved. Now he was the one trying to take something away from me. Margaret, Harold said gently, I need to ask you something important. I opened my eyes. What is it? Do you want to pursue this legally? That question carried weight. Real weight. Because pursuing it legally didn't just mean fixing the lease situation. It meant officially documenting what Daniel had done. Fraud. Unauthorized rental. Attempted sale of property he didn't own. It meant lawyers, paperwork, possibly even court. And once that door opened, there would be no pretending this was just a family disagreement. It would become something else entirely. I looked around the room again. At Laura and Mike standing quietly near the hallway. At little Ethan now drawing on a piece of paper at the kitchen table. At the house that still held 30 years of my memories. Then I answered. Yes. My voice was calm. Steady. Yes, Harold, I said. I think it's time my son learned something about consequences. There was a short pause on the phone. Then Harold replied with quiet approval. In that case, he said, the first thing we're going to do is call Daniel together. I held the phone a little tighter after Harold said that. Call Daniel together? Yes, Harold replied calmly. If we're going to resolve this, it's better that he understands the legal situation immediately. I glanced toward Laura and Mike again. They were still standing quietly, clearly aware that something important was about to happen. All right, I said. Harold continued. Put the phone on speaker if you can. I'd like to speak to him directly. I pressed the speaker button and placed the phone on the coffee table. The room suddenly felt very still. Laura gently guided Ethan back into the kitchen so he wouldn't hear the conversation. Mike stayed near the hallway but kept a respectful distance. I opened my contact list and tapped Daniel's number again. The phone rang once, twice, 3 times. Then he answered. Mom, he said, sounding slightly annoyed. Didn't we already talk about this? My voice stayed calm. Yes, Daniel. We did. There was a small pause. But now someone else would like to speak with you. Another pause. What do you mean? This is Harold Simmons, Harold said clearly through the speaker. Margaret Carter's attorney. The silence on the line was immediate. Heavy. Then Daniel gave a short laugh. Wait, you got a lawyer involved? Yes, Harold said simply. Daniel sounded irritated now. Seriously, Mom? You called a lawyer over this? I was trying to help you. Harold didn't raise his voice. Daniel, I'll be very direct, so there's no confusion. We've reviewed the county property records. The house remains fully titled in your mother's name. So, Daniel said. So, Harold continued. You had no legal authority to rent the property. There was another pause. Then Daniel spoke again, more defensively. She's my mother. It's basically my house eventually. That is not how property law works, Harold replied calmly. I could almost imagine Daniel rolling his eyes on the other end of the phone. You're blowing this way out of proportion, he said. Harold continued without reacting. In addition to the unauthorized lease, we've also located records showing you attempted to list the property for sale last month. This time the silence was longer, much longer. Finally Daniel spoke again, but his voice had changed slightly. Look, I was just exploring options. Selling a property you do not own is not exploring options, Harold said. Mike quietly crossed his arms across the room as he listened. I could see Laura standing just inside the kitchen doorway, watching anxiously. Daniel tried again. I was planning to talk to Mom about it. When? Harold asked calmly. After the house was sold? Another silence. Then Daniel said something that made my chest tighten. Mom doesn't need that house anymore. That sentence hung in the air. After everything. 32 years. The mortgage. The repairs. The memories. My entire life in that place. And to him, it was just a house I didn't need. I leaned slightly closer to the phone. Daniel, I said quietly. He hesitated. Yeah? For the first time during the conversation, my voice carried a firmness he probably hadn't heard from me before. You don't get to decide what I need. There was a long pause. Then Harold spoke again. Daniel, here are your options. The room seemed to hold its breath as he continued. You can correct this situation voluntarily. Or we can let the court correct it for you. The silence after Harold finished speaking felt heavier than anything that had come before. You can correct this situation voluntarily, or we can let the court correct it for you. On the other end of the phone, Daniel didn't respond right away. For the first time since this conversation started, he sounded uncertain. What exactly do you want me to do? He finally asked. Harold answered calmly. First, you will immediately cancel the lease agreement you created. Second, you will return every dollar you collected from these tenants. Third, you will confirm in writing that you have no authority over Margaret Carter's property. Daniel let out a frustrated breath. That's ridiculous. No, Harold replied evenly. What's ridiculous is renting and attempting to sell property you do not own. Another long pause followed. I could hear Daniel shifting around on the other end of the line, probably pacing the way he used to when he was nervous as a teenager. Finally he said, quieter this time. So what? You're just going to take my mother's side. Harold didn't hesitate. I'm representing the legal owner of the property. And that is your mother. The words landed exactly where they needed to. Daniel didn't argue again. Instead, his voice dropped into something closer to resignation. Fine. Laura and Mike both looked at each other in relief. I'll transfer their money back, Daniel said. And cancel the lease. Harold spoke again. I also strongly suggest you remove any listing related to the property immediately. I already did, Daniel muttered. Harold nodded, even though Daniel couldn't see it. Good. The conversation ended shortly after that. No apology. No long explanation. Just a quiet, uncomfortable goodbye. When I hung up the phone, the room stayed silent for a moment. Then Laura finally exhaled. Wow, she said softly. Mike shook his head. I can't believe he tried to sell the place. Neither could I. But strangely, I didn't feel angry anymore. Just tired. 30 years of raising a child, and learning something new about him at 68. I stood up slowly from the couch and looked around my house again. My house. The same walls. The same floors. The same memories. But somehow the room felt a little different now. Stronger, maybe. Like it had just passed a test. Mike walked over and extended his hand. Thank you for being fair with us, he said. We'll start looking for another place right away. You don't have to rush tonight, I told them gently. Take your time. Laura smiled gratefully. Ethan ran past us a moment later with his toy truck, laughing as if none of this had ever happened. I watched him for a second, remembering a little boy who used to run through this exact same hallway years ago. Time changes people, sometimes in ways you don't expect. Later that evening, after the house had grown quiet again, I sat on my porch with a cup of coffee. The maple tree rustled softly in the wind, the same sound I had listened to for decades. And I realized something important. Growing older doesn't mean giving up control of your life. It doesn't mean letting people make decisions for you, even if those people are family. Because respect, real respect, isn't given automatically. Sometimes it has to be reminded. And that day, in my own home, my son learned exactly who that house truly belonged to.